This was not news to politicians and decision makers in the military. American Jewish organizations have tried for almost 5 years to convince the Allies to either bomb the camps or bomb the railroads, etc., etc. And was refused as not a military priority, whatever. But in 1945, having this type of evidence, there was visual, cruel, direct, had possibly an impact on either the Western public or Germany. Do you think that had it been used extensively, that would have changed? I know questions with F are not easy to answer in that respect. The way we treat human rights and warfare in general and responsibility of states, regardless on what side of a particular war they sit. And the second question to you is, neither Israel nor the United States have signed up to ICC, or for the automatic provision of ICC. Do you think that had this type of film been more widely used, not because the information is not there, I mean, the information about the Holocaust, it's widespread, but just the sheer visual nature of this type of documentary would have changed the way Western publics request that?
I think the sort of the grey-bearded cynic in me would have to admit probably not. I mean, in a way, to both sides of that question, that I think the importance of the message that Richard Crossman made at the end of that film, which is really what this whole story and this whole exercise, if you call it, or filmmaking exercise is about, which is that the world needs to learn from these pictures, and if not, night will fall. And then by God's grace, we who live will learn, is a wonderful sentiment. And I think had it been put across in 1945, it might have assuaged a few Western consciences, but I don't think, quite honestly, it would have made a huge amount of difference. And I mean, I think there's a huge area of moral responsibility of government and why such a thing should be suppressed and why not. That would take too long to get into, but it revolves around that sort of area you're talking about. But the only clue I can give is that when Billy Wilder's film was released in the American sector in Germany, they did insist and they forced German populations to sit down. Sorry, am I clear enough on this? They forced German populations to sit down and watch in cinemas around Germany. And they did questionnaires and surveys about the impact. And nothing really could be said about that there was a category of audience who dismissed it. There was always the minority of deniers, as there always are in any audience, which, to my mind, the evidence just makes that a kind of a derangement. I just don't understand that. But there are always a category there. The greatest audience who viewed it expressed shock and horror and denied knowing about it. So they didn't deny the events, but they denied knowing about it, and it wasn't their responsibility. That was the Nazis. We weren't Nazis. We might have voted for them once in the past, but it wasn't our fault. And then there was a category who said that, okay, but they deserved it, kind of attitude. But in other words, the hard-nosed, still supporters of National Socialism at the time and so on. Whether the impact of the imagery of the Wilder film and whether the same would have been the case of the Bernstein film would have affected audiences in 1945, I think it's hard to say, because the whole morass of what was happening in the world at that time, had changed. The Germans were starving, the cities were destroyed, people had other priorities, and the evil doings of their last regime, everybody wanted to bury at that particular time. And it's taken initially 40 years and then 70 years before people are sort of suddenly picking up on it. So I would like to feel that in 1945 it would have had an impact, but I think it would have been minimal. But that's not to say it shouldn't have been shown. I mean, my belief is it should have been shown. I think it was a wrong decision, and for all sorts of expedient purposes. And the second part of that is whether today it has any impact, I think is to some extent, obviously, to me, more important. And that's difficult to say. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of a new generation learning, seeing, and understanding what happened to previous generations still within living memory. So this is living history. And I think new generations need to know. I have 3 sons, and they knew very little about it until they saw the film and so on. And to me, it's shocking that people don't know about it and people don't understand what was happening. And I think it's important that, even though it's graphically horrific, and I don't want horror footage to be used for its own sake, but to understand what happened, you have to show some of this material. So I think it's important that a new generation does see it, and I would hope that just in a little way, that might affect people's attitudes about their relationship with others, their tolerance for others, their acceptance, the move against anti-Semitism, against racism, against that kind of intolerance. I hope something like this just makes one pause and think. But whether that's the case, I don't know. That just might be a sort of a false idealism for my part.
Your documentary raises the question of well-discussed topic, that of the crisis of imagination, of the limits of representation. Saul Friedlander edited a very well-known book about that. So even when we see images like that, even when we face horror, it is still difficult to understand what happened, to imagine the process of killing, to see, to imagine the identity of people who were behind those glasses, some people don't want to know about the Holocaust because they are purely anti-Semitic. Some other people are ignorant; they don't know. Or some others, they are not interested in the issue because they don't consider it. That was also reflected in your film. They don't consider the story as part of their personal story, of their national story, and something which looks like a human story. Because what Nazi Germany did was that they didn't only degraded human life, they also, as an Italian philosopher said, they degraded death. So this is a reflection of the degradation of death. So my question is, and actually I would like you to summarize some of the reactions to the screening of this kind of film, which is very graphic, and how can it be used in, let's say, educational terms, especially keeping in mind that it is very graphic.
Before you answer, I wanted you to know this is Adrian Cioflucă. He's a historian. He's working on Holocaust issues, and he's done a great job in exposing, pictures of Romanian Holocaust, death trains and pogroms, so that you know the background of it.
In no particular order, the reaction from audiences has been, I think, from my perspective, gratifyingly strong, good, positive. I think the issue that is in the centre of all of what you're saying, and it's a thing that preoccupied me throughout the whole of the making of the film, was not the justification of showing graphic imagery, but to what extent and how do you use that. To some extent, I used as my guide the ability of the survivors in the camps and the interviewees that I discussed this with. I used them as my guide in a way, because I felt that if they found the material offensive in any way, and I could see how some people could find it offensive, then I'd have to really think very, very hard again. But I didn't get that reaction. Audiences generally have been extremely positive, even about the use of material, with one or two exceptions. And the exceptions have been, which I find an extremely important issue for me, which is that the Imperial War Museum, who have constructed the film, have refused to allow me to use any of their material for education. And their rationale is that they have a policy that graphic imagery, particularly of the dead, should not be shown to young people. I understand where they're coming from, but I think they're grossly out of date in terms of they're a pre-internet age, and I don't know any young person, I'm talking anything from say 15 upwards, who couldn't access any of the graphic imagery with two presses of a button if they wanted to, because the material is there. None of this material is not accessible by anybody if they worked hard enough on the computer. And so it seems that if you're looking at imagery like that out of context, it has to me, an air of pornography about it. It's destructive. If you use it in context, and if the rationale for it is an explanation of what is happening and why, and reaction to it, then I think it's justified. So in the end, having sort of moved my own moral compass from how can I put something like this that I've lived with for a long time and watched and seen and so on, how can I put this out to a general public? And it was something that any sane, sensible person would have to worry about. It moved to, well, how much and how, in context, how much can I use? And about 50% of the material that I originally had, I dropped from the film. There was much, much more originally. And I thought I was careful enough to only use excerpts from the film because this is a story about a film, not the story of the Holocaust. It's a story about a film of the Holocaust imagery. There's only 12 minutes from the original film here, and the film lasts 75 minutes, their film. And only 12 of the minutes appears in this. So that's reasonably select. And the other images I used, almost without exception, were of the characters or filmed by the characters that I was describing. And anything that I felt was superfluous, just to throw it in as what I think in our film terms we would call wallpaper, I rejected. So whether that, I've kind of meandered, and I'm not sure I've now answered your question, but I still think, and I still maintain, that you can't make a film of this nature about this subject without the graphic imagery. And I was involved in, I don't know if anyone here has seen it, but I was involved in another film that has been quite successful. I wasn't the director, I was an executive, called The Act of Killing, about genocide in Indonesia, which is an extraordinary film. And here you have a very extremely beautifully constructed film where you do not see a single graphic image of the dead. You see reenactment, you see the perpetrators putting on war paint and playing games of genocide, but you don't see bodies like you do in this film. You couldn't have made this film in the same way. It was just a completely different mindset, a different thing. So I think on reflection, although it's been something I've angst about a long time, I think I feel justified in that, and I don't feel apologetic about using that imagery. I think one has to.
I have a particularly delicate question, maybe a little bit naive. The production of the Bernstein film, it predates the bombing of Hiroshima, right?
So
it predates the bombing of Hiroshima of Japan.
It preceded that, yes.
Do you think that if the movie had been produced earlier, it would have affected the opinion of the American public towards that action, and it might have helped avoid a great tragedy?
No, I think it's a very pertinent question. I mean, I think first of all, you have to think in terms of historical context, because what happened in 1945, after the end of the war, was that this was, if you like, the shock horror that exposed the Nazi regime. In Germany. But meanwhile, the war was continuing in Japan, in the East, the war in Asia. I don't think anything would have mitigated the impact of this, because it was different. So the shock of Hiroshima came at the end of the year, and it was one of the things that was beginning to preoccupy the Americans in particular, between the end of the war and the dropping of the bomb, so that the attention was being paid there and less and less attention to what had happened in Europe. Basically, there was a kind of an attitude, it's been done, we finished with it, we've done Europe, Germans have been beaten, forget about Germany, we've got to look at the Russians, we've got to look at the Japanese, we've got to see what's happening over there, and Europe is a sort of passé already. And to me, the shock of that in historical terms is the speed with which that happened. So everybody's focus went away. Now, had the two events been reversed, I mean, you know, historical sort of hypotheses are pretty dangerous things to sort of play around with. But I don't think, you know, what we're seeing here is what happened at home, if you like, close to home. It affected everybody. It was over there. People in Germany. Germany was sort of linked to the UK, it was part of the European family, if you like, so it was a very different kind of mindset. What was happening in Japan was a kind of alien, long way away, and it affected the Americans more than it did the British at that time, so I don't think it would have made a difference.
And my second question is related to filmmaking more. As far as you talked about decision-making, making the documentary and cutting 12 minutes from the original film, how do you cope with that? And other than talking with the people you interviewed, watching the material and processing it, how did it affect you, and what's the difficulty behind all that?
How did it affect me?
Yes.
When I started the process, and when I had to go through their reconstruction, which I did many, many times, my initial fear was, I mean, partly fear, partly perhaps I was hoping the other way, was that if you see enough material like this, you become anaesthetized to it. It doesn't affect you anymore. You've seen it, you become blasé. And this is what sort of, you know, medical profession, doctors who deal with trauma, for example, don't see it anymore. They just know how to react. They don't have the emotional time. And I had expected, I think initially, that would be the case with this, that I was when I first saw their film, I think traumatized is too strong a word, but I was quite shocked by it. And I was in an audience, an invited audience, to see it for the first time. And there was a huge silence at the end of the film. Nobody quite knew how to react or to say things or so on. And I think, you know, the effect of seeing that imagery for the first time was pretty shocking. I find it very difficult to watch it now. I've seen it so many times, but I find it still has the same impact. So I think on one hand that's a good thing, because it should do. On the other hand, it is a depressing and distressing thing to have. So I sort of feel it's, you know, I've lived for 2 years with it, and it's sort of, I think, sort of imbued in my soul these days. I mean, to use a rather dramatic expression, but how it's affected in general, I don't know. I think it's made me, and I hope it makes people who see the film the same way. It makes me, what I was saying earlier, just a little more thoughtful about intolerance, because I think it all boils down to the matter of intolerance. And it's kind of why I'm so in favour of a younger generation seeing it, who might have heard, might know a little bit about it, but don't really know the details of what went on at that time. And this is living history. This is, you know, people close to us, people who could be our parents, grandparents, and so on there. And so it's, you know, it's very easy to dismiss the horror in Rwanda or in Cambodia or wherever, because it doesn't touch us in the same way. We may be shocked, but, you know, this just makes you feel like, I think Dimbleby said in the film, that this could be any one of us, and it could have happened to any one of our families. And the more you think of that, the more you perhaps pause about any future reference to tolerance or intolerance.